Thanks for joining us today. This is part two of the summer series webinars on the topic of compliance. Thank you very much for joining us. Quick agenda, and then we'll do intros. We're going to talk about the evolution in the world of IT security, risk, and compliance, give you some context and some history of how we got to where we are today. We're going to talk about breaches. Then we'll dive into laws, standards, and regulations that affect us in the identity world. We'll tie all that back to compliance, and then we'll wrap up and take questions. My name is Steve Shearer. I'm a security architect with IC Consult. I've been doing IT security and identity for many years. I've acted as both a consultant and I've been a customer as well. And I'm joined today by my partner in crime, Max Borchardt. Max, you want to talk about yourself?
Sure. Thanks very much, Steve. My name is Max Borchardt. I'm a director in our advisory practice here at IC Consult, and I've been doing identity and access management focused consulting for a little over a decade now. I'm very excited to join you today, Steve, and talk about my favorite topic, compliance.
Yes, sir. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through about the last 2 decades, and we're going to talk about some key events in both the compliance world as well as the identity world.
I think a good place to start is probably Sarbanes-Oxley. As most folks know, Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, is a regulation passed for publicly traded companies. So in order to be a publicly traded company, organizations must meet certain controls around their financially significant applications. And this is really key to our compliance timeline here, because previous to Sarbanes-Oxley, the enterprise space was very much sort of a free-for-all. Organizations adopted the controls that made sense to them as an organization, but there was no specific regulation requiring organizations to adopt IT security controls. But with the enactment of SOX, of course, organizations do have to enact certain controls for instance, financially significant applications, and the costs from this can vary widely. It's important to think about when Sarbanes-Oxley came to fruition and the other things occurring in the industry at the time.
Certainly. So prior to 2000, we were kind of in the wild, wild west. In the world of identity and access management, we had the concept of passwords, and we also had the formation of directory services. Passwords were very crude. There were very few rules. There were very few standards. And if you had network access to application environments, you probably had free access to a whole lot of things. The evolution of directory services helped to centralize a lot of the data around accounts and passwords, and they provided key mechanisms for enterprise to develop strategies. And some of the early products included Netscape, if you remember Netscape Directory Server, which eventually became Sutton's product. Microsoft developed Active Directory, which became the core of its Windows 2000. We also had early single sign-on, which came around in products such as Securant, that eventually was bought by RSA, became what was called Clear Trust. And then we moved on past into the 2000s.
Shortly after the SOX standard, or the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, we had the payment card industry come out with their own standard here. So the payment card industry DSS, or data security standard, is put together by a conglomerate of those in the payment card industry. So think Amex, MasterCard, Discover. And it creates a series of controls that vendors who accept credit cards must comply with in order to continue to accept cards from each of the vendors I just named, right? So, the cost of compliance for this regulation are very high. For many businesses, not being able to accept credit cards from the major credit card brands would severely limit their income. And so many vendors have had to comply with the PCI DSS, even if they aren't publicly traded and subject to SOX compliance. Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about IAM and how that fits in?
Yeah, so right around this time in the early aughts, and actually the late 90s even, there was the start of what we call identity governance and administration products, or what would become the IGA products. So in 1995, we actually had a product come out by a company in Germany called Volcker. The product was named Active Entry, and that was probably one of the early comprehensive provisioning products that came out, and was followed in 2000 by Waveset Lighthouse. Fun fact is that Volcker was eventually purchased by Quest Software, and that product, Active Entry, is now what has become the One Identity Manager product. Around the same time, there were some standards being developed in the single sign-on world, which allowed multiple domains, multiple organizations to be part of a common login process. what's known as Identity Federation. And that was the SAML standard, which became a pervasive standard used by most vendors now supporting SAML as a required standard by everybody.
And of course, early 2000s, we also saw the emergence of advanced persistent threats. So these generally were nation state actors or organizations as opposed to lone wolves that were persistently attacking organizations, right? So they weren't just taking sort of a lone wolf opportunistic route on their attacks. They were consistently over time attempting to break into networks, to move laterally, to step up their access. And these organizations tended to have more advanced capabilities. At the same time, we also saw the rise of social media. So as Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, MySpace, some of these other services became prevalent, many organizations began to adopt their credentials in a federated fashion in order to register accounts, in order to access systems.
In the late 2000s, there was the emergence of early IDaaS providers. So it wasn't necessarily called IDaaS at the time, but that's what we call it now. There was one login, which came about in 2009 as an early IDaaS solution, early IDaaS service. Around that same time, Okta came about and Azure AD emerged to support the Microsoft 365 and Azure ecosystems. Those services became what's widely known as IDaaS today. Also, fun fact, that one login product was acquired by Quest and One Identity recently and is now part of the One Identity portfolio. At the same time, some of the original standards that came out, so you recall we talked about SAML, we had the emergence of SPML, some people called it SPAML, but SPML came out in 2006. That was an effort to rein in provisioning operations and put some common language around resource and service provisioning operations. That kind of had mixed results in terms of who adopted it and how widely it was utilized. Around 2011, SCIM emerged, and SCIM has now become the de facto standard for cross-domain provisioning on the cloud space as well as on-premise.
And that's a good transition here. I think another thing we saw developing around that same time period was the emergence of cloud computing. So as enterprises began to shift their computing workload to the cloud, they also began to give up some of the controls that they were used to within the network environment. So all of a sudden you had all of your computing services, as opposed to being located on your local network, open to the internet potentially and hosted on someone else's network.
And finally, in the identity and access management space, around 2014, we had the emergence of OIDC. So prior to OIDC, there was a variety of standards that emerged, OAuth being one of them. OIDC provides a single sign-on mechanism that rides on top of OAuth and has been widely adopted by product vendors and service providers. So currently OIDC, along with SCIM, are two of the standards that you want to look for when adopting new technologies.
Absolutely. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about privacy regulations that have recently come into the fold. So GDPR really took the lead when the European Union passed this regulation. It really began to shift how European companies or global companies began to think about how their data was stored and used. GDPR has the potential for very large penalties for organizations and has a number of specific controls around data residency, permissions to use data, things like that. So for many programs, GDPR has really shifted their compliance programs to a need to focus on privacy as well as security. And lastly, of course, we have the COVID epidemic. In early 2020, as the COVID epidemic exploded, many organizations suddenly found themselves forced to adopt a remote workforce. And so this really led to the need to secure people's access no matter where they were, to think about what devices they were logging in from, things like logging in from one location and then another location, and travel time and things like that. So a number of different potential controls to consider here in order for an organization to continue to operate safely within this remote workforce world. Steve, do you think you could summarize some of what we just talked through in our history of compliance?
Okay, so we've gone through a couple decades worth of history in security, compliance, and some of the developments in the identity world along those times. So why should we focus on compliance? Well, if you think back 2 years, everybody should remember the SolarWinds debacle. SolarWinds was a wake-up call for many folks. I mean, there were certainly a lot of big breaches prior to SolarWinds, But SolarWinds was what we call a supply chain attack. SolarWinds cost SolarWinds a lot of money. So it cost them, 15, $20 million, I believe. But the larger industry impact from that breach, because of the nature of the supply chain attack, was in the order of $100 billion. And that included the largest IT service providers, such as Microsoft, Cisco, you name it, as well as US federal agencies, and many past those hundreds of large, well-known brands. It impacted many, many more smaller enterprises that use this software. So Max, what are some other breaches that we could maybe think about and to understand the magnitude and help people understand what the urgency is here to act?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. So we have some of the big and well-known breaches here up on the screen. And, for every one of these breaches, not only were they impactful from a financial perspective, in terms of fines, in terms of cleanup, those sorts of things for these organizations, but they also cause reputational and brand harm, right? And so, I can remember working for one of Marriott's competitors at the time with the Marriott breach. I can tell you, seeing Marriott recover from this breach and all of the damage it caused, both reputationally as well as financially, caused its competitors in the industry, right, to change a little bit of how they act and to take compliance and cybersecurity much more seriously. I remember some of the competitors in the industry all of a sudden had much larger cybersecurity and compliance budgets after that Marriott breach, because they saw very near and dear one of their competitors seeing some of the issues that can crop up from this. And I think, Steve, when we think about the damage that these breaches can cause, being out of compliance, fines, cleanup, all of these things, right? One place organizations often turn to is cybersecurity insurance. But as we know, that's not always a catch-all.
Correct. Yeah. Cybersecurity insurance has become a requirement for most enterprises. Unfortunately, it does not get you out of the need to build your program and understand compliance. Most of these insurance policies also require you to have a compliance program and require evidence to that effect. Also, there are certain things that are just simply not covered by cyber security insurance. Max mentioned reputational damage. Certainly, cyber insurance is going to give you some money, but it's not going to fix your reputation. There's also certain types of attacks that are just not covered, as well as certain fines that cyber insurance will not pay for if you're negligent in your duties to protect your assets and your customers.
Absolutely. It's a good point. Cybersecurity insurance may reimburse you a little bit, but it's not going to bring your customers back. So when we think about everything that we've run through so far, Steve, I think it would be helpful for us to talk through how to build a security program around some of the regulations that organizations need to comply with.
For sure. So yeah, there's a bewildering array of acronyms to keep track of here. So what we've done is we've broken it into 4 layers. We got laws, control frameworks, some best practices and standards, as well as actual technical protocols or technical specifications. So Max, you want to walk us through some of the laws and regulations that are important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've discussed a few of these, and I'm sure folks will recognize some of the others that we have here. But, when building a compliance program, the first place for most organizations to start, of course, is with the laws and regulations that your organization needs to comply with. When you're looking to build a list of controls, procedures, things like that you need to comply with, it's helpful to start, first with those regulations. It might be HIPAA if you're in the healthcare space, NERC if you're in the power and utility space, and to select the controls and the requirements of those laws and regulations as a starting point for building your compliance program. And as a next step here, Steve, you want to walk us through the program and control frameworks?
Yeah. So once you've got an awareness of what laws and regulations apply to your organization, then where do you start? Well, there are a number of frameworks available that provide a structure for what controls constitute a comprehensive compliance program. So some of the key ones to understand are ISO. ISO is probably the largest and most well-known program. You can actually get certified in ISO by a certified ISO auditor. So if certification is a requirement for your business, this is a good one. But this one is very large, very complex, and generally global companies with lots of budget. For smaller businesses, NIST CSF or cybersecurity framework, CIS security controls, those are going to be good places to start because they're a little bit smaller in scope. They also still do a really good job of covering the full gamut. If you're in the federal space as a federal contractor for the United States government, NIST 853 and FedRAMP are going to be very important for you as a federal contractor or a federal agency. And then Secure Control Framework, or SCF, is also really important to know about. That is an organization that's built their own framework. They're like a specialty compliance group, and they have a mapping across all these other frameworks. So across many of the security tools, frameworks, and standards that you can think of, they have mapped them all to each other so that if you implement one framework, you can understand your coverage across all the others. So I would highly recommend looking into SCF.
Absolutely. SCF makes it easier to go ahead and map your controls, right? So once you've chosen the laws and regulations that your organization, has to comply with, potentially selected additional controls from some of the program control frameworks, you can look to the specifications and standards, some of which I have here, for ways to actually go ahead and implement those controls. So you build your list of controls from a combination of your laws, additional controls from your program control frameworks. That builds your overall control framework for your organization or your enterprise, and then you need to look to implement those controls. And then lastly here, we have a number of protocols. These can really build the foundation for how you implement some of these controls and how they're enacted. Steve, do you want to take a few minutes and just walk us through those?
Sure. We've covered OIDC, we covered SCIM, SAML, mentioned OAuth and LDAP. There are a bunch of them. So we could go into depth on them. It would take us another hour. What's really important for you to understand, though, is when you're selecting a lot of the best of breed identity and access management products today, those products are going to do a pretty good job of implementing all of these. And so as long as you choose best of breed products, you're probably going to be covered.
And last but not least, we couldn't leave out privacy.
Oh, yes. One of my favorite topics. So privacy has become really hot in the last couple of years. We mentioned it earlier. The Europeans did a really good job of enacting a comprehensive law. That was 7 years ago now. 2016, they passed it. They put it into practice in 2018 and has now been levying fines for several years. Most of the laws in the US are following on that European approach. CCPA, or the California version of our comprehensive privacy legislation, that was passed and just started enforcing their fines in 2020, starting with Sephora at, I believe, 1.6 million. And then many other states are now following and passing their laws. There's several that are already in place and a bunch more in process. The challenge here is that if you're doing business in the United States and you're doing cross-state business, you have to be aware of all of these emerging privacy laws. They might or might not all apply to you. And you're probably liable for compliance with many of them, depending upon your business and your customers. The federal government, of course, is making efforts to pass a comprehensive federal privacy law. They may take years to get something passed. In the meantime, this is a major challenge for businesses today, and your compliance program needs to incorporate privacy as one of its key components.
I think for organizations doing international business, you'll find that GDPR is preeminent privacy law globally at the moment. And many of the states, including California, have crafted their privacy laws after the controls in GDPR. All right. We've talked through a number of different areas in cybersecurity, and we have a number of different areas here on the screen here that you should be considering as part of your compliance program. Some of which we've talked about, but a few of which I think are newer ones that have become more prevalent. One that's near and dear to my heart is ITDR, or Identity Threat Detection and Response. So as Steve was mentioning earlier, a number of these identity tools and software tools have proliferated and become very common. They use a lot of the standards that are out there, but they've become so large and have so many configurations, settings, things like that. There's become a need to sort of monitor the actual identity tool. So very similar to how a traditional SOC works. A lot of these tools look to find misconfigurations, find folks who maybe don't have strong MFA factors, things like that, and step those up. So one area that's become a hot topic in the compliance space is ITDR, an important area to consider within your compliance program. Steve, are there other areas here you'd like to touch on that are key components of a compliance program?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about many of these already. One that we haven't spoken about that's kind of important is privileged access management. Privileged access management has also become a requirement for many programs in recent years just because of the sheer number of IT resources. They all have the notion of privileged access. There are various tools and techniques that have developed to protect the accounts as well as the resources, as well as monitoring how those resources are accessed in a privileged manner. So those tools have become very important. Also, PBAC, or policy-based access control, has emerged as a way of enforcing what we call fine-grained access control. So basically enforcing access control with the notion of an identity context all across your ecosystem. So not just when the user logs in, but at every resource that they interact with. So those are two kind of emerging areas. Well, I wouldn't say PAM is emerging, but PBAC has emerged more recently. But in general, you need to be aware of all of these. And many of these turn into what we call IAM initiatives. They may turn into projects to deploy some of these capabilities or integrate them with existing systems or infrastructure. Yeah, so in summary, compliance in general can be a very challenging, very frustrating to keep up with. It's also not what I would call sexy. It can be very tedious, but it is reality, and it is something that we have no choice. We have to understand our obligations, and we have to understand our risk, and the compliance programs that we put together will enable us to deal with that. How do we start? Well, we can certainly help you start out. Please contact us. We can help you with strategy, advisory, roadmaps, planning, as well as product implementation in any of these areas. If you have any questions, contact us at the contact information provided here. We really appreciate your time. We also wanted to thank our partner, One Identity, for sponsoring this webinar. And with that, we would love to answer any questions you have.
And then I'd also note that as questions are coming in, we have 2 more webinars coming up this summer. So if you're interested in the topic of IT and IT security complexity, how to resolve complexity, how to simplify your identity program, I'll be doing a short webinar on that August 9th. And then another one on August 23rd, focusing on compatibility of your identity program with the organization, as well as the tools within your identity program.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve and Max. I just have a couple of questions. Steve, I think this one's for you. What about the NIS2 law? Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how it impacts the access management teams?
Sure, surely, thanks. NIS2 is a European law, so it was passed, well, NIS was passed in 2016. NIS2 is being deployed right now. It was passed recently, and this year and next year it's being put into practice. NIS2 is important for businesses that are operating in the EU for sure, but also if you're elsewhere and you have employees or customers or business that operates in the EU, this applies to you. Certain industries, certain size businesses, it applies to more than others, but in the identity space, there's definitely some impacts. Number one, there's large fines, new fines, higher fines, and stricter requirements for these businesses. In the identity space, there's definitely some additional controls. There's an enhanced requirement to perform multi-factor authentication, have an incident response plan, monitor and audit your systems. So not things that hopefully you already have some of these things if you have a good compliance program, but now it's being made a law for a lot of businesses in certain industries.
Thank you, Steve. I think we just one quick question as a follow-up. Sure. Max, this is for you. There was a US EU data privacy framework that passed recently. How did that affect us?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the private EU privacy framework is, layers on some additional considerations beyond what GDPR already sets out. But, I think for the most part, I think GDPR is going to be sort of the preeminent privacy regulation, certainly in Europe and then as well, through the rest of the world. But it does have some additional considerations in there and things that, an identity program can assist a compliance program with sort of assuring compliance with, whether those are sort of customer facing things like, acknowledgement of cookies and other sorts of tracking and things like that, as well as workforce side things as well. So, you may have employees whose data you need to share across borders and things like that. So it covers that a little bit as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Max. Great session. Don't forget, we've got 2 more upcoming webinars, one on August 9th on complexity and one on August 23rd on compatibility. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. Take care.
Thank you, guys.